Jonathan Carter adjusted his tie as he stood at the boarding gate, feeling a mixture of pride and quiet apprehension. Today marked a milestone in his career, his first major business trip as a senior executive at a prestigious firm. Dressed in a sharp navy blue suit that complemented his polished leather shoes, Jonathan looked every bit the accomplished professional he had worked so hard to become. The announcement for first-class boarding rang out, and Jonathan, clutching his neatly packed briefcase, walked toward the gate. As he stepped through the jet bridge and into the pristine cabin of the plane, he couldn't help but notice the curious glances of a few passengers already seated. The air was thick with the faint hum of murmured conversations, but the attention directed his way was palpable. Jonathan had grown accustomed to such moments. Being one of the few black men in his field often drew stares, sometimes out of admiration, but more often out of silent, unspoken judgment. He took a deep breath and reminded himself why he was here. He had earned this. Every long night, every challenge he'd overcome, it all led to this seat in first class, a symbol of his success and persistence. Sliding into the plush leather seat, he exhaled slowly, hoping for a peaceful flight. The scent of freshly brewed coffee wafted through the cabin as passengers settled in, the soft ding of overhead compartments closing adding to the rhythmic cadence of pre-flight preparations. Jonathan leaned back, staring out of the window as the sun painted streaks of gold across the tarmac. But the tranquility was short-lived. A woman in her mid-30s, wearing the crisp uniform of the airline's first-class crew, approached with a bright smile that felt slightly forced. Her name tag read Melissa Thompson. She carried an air of professionalism, but there was something in her demeanor that made Jonathan uneasy, a flicker of hesitation in her gaze, a lingering pause before she spoke. "Good afternoon, sir," she began, her tone sweet, but almost too rehearsed. "Would you care for a glass of champagne before takeoff?" Jonathan glanced up, his expression polite but guarded. "No, thank you," he replied evenly. Melissa's smile tightened, and she tilted her head slightly, as though appraising him. "That's surprising," she said lightly, her voice carrying an edge of something Jonathan couldn't quite place. "Most people in first class can't resist." The comment lingered uncomfortably in the air. Jonathan chose not to respond, instead turning his attention back to the window. Melissa's presence remained, her shadow casting a subtle pall over his peace. "Well," she added after a beat, "if you change your mind, just let me know. Enjoy your seat." Her emphasis on the word seat was almost imperceptible, but Jonathan felt it like a subtle jab. He glanced around the cabin, catching a few more curious looks from fellow passengers. A knot of tension began to form in his chest, but he refused to let it show. Years of navigating spaces where he wasn't always welcomed had taught him the value of composure. As Melissa walked away, Jonathan's mind raced. Was he imagining things? Was her tone truly condescending, or was he projecting his own anxieties onto the situation? He tried to shake off the discomfort, but the seed of unease had been planted, growing quietly in the back of his mind. The flight attendants continued their pre-flight routine, handing out menus and assisting other passengers. Melissa moved with the same polished efficiency, yet her earlier comment lingered in Jonathan's thoughts like a splinter. Moments later, the captain's voice crackled through the intercom, announcing their imminent departure. Jonathan fastened his seatbelt, focusing on the rhythmic thrum of the engines coming to life. He hoped that the flight would progress without incident, allowing him to focus on the upcoming presentation that had brought him here in the first place. Yet, deep down, he couldn't shake the feeling that this journey was going to test him in ways he hadn't anticipated. The flight had barely taken off when Melissa Thompson returned to the first-class cabin, her polished demeanor intact, but her eyes revealing a subtle, scrutinizing curiosity. Jonathan Carter, seated near the window, caught her approach out of the corner of his eye. He braced himself, willing the knot in his stomach to loosen. He told himself not to overthink it. Maybe the earlier exchange had been innocuous. Maybe he was reading too much into it. Melissa stopped by his seat, this time holding a tray of drinks. Her smile seemed wider now, almost exaggerated. "Still not interested in champagne, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her voice pitched with a mix of politeness and something harder to define. Jonathan looked up at her, his face composed, his tone measured. "No, thank you. I'm fine." Melissa tilted her head, a glint of mischief or malice dancing in her eyes. "You know," she said, setting the tray down on the console, "you don't look like the usual people we have up here. First class tends to attract, well, a certain type." Her words hung in the air like an unwelcome guest, and Jonathan felt a rush of heat crawl up his neck. He forced himself to meet her gaze, his voice calm but firm. "And what type would that be?" Melissa blinked as if caught off guard by his directness. She let out a small laugh, brushing imaginary dust off her immaculate uniform. "Oh, you know," she said lightly, avoiding his question, "the polished, refined types who seem born to this life." Jonathan's grip tightened on the armrest. The thinly veiled insinuation landed like a slap, but he refused to let it show. He had dealt with this before: the coded language, the patronizing tone, the quiet but clear message that he didn't belong. He took a slow breath, his eyes unwavering. "I assure you," he said evenly, "I belong exactly where I am." Melissa's smile faltered for a moment before she quickly recovered, her professional mask slipping back into place. "Of course," she said, her voice almost sing-song. "If there's anything you need, don't hesitate to let me know." As she walked away, Jonathan felt the weight of her words settle into his chest. He looked around the cabin, hoping for a distraction, but instead caught the subtle glances of other passengers. Some seemed curious, others indifferent, but a few were unmistakably judgmental. One man in a gray suit whispered something to his companion, and they both chuckled softly, their eyes flicking briefly toward Jonathan. He turned his gaze back to the window, his reflection staring back at him. It wasn't the first time he had been made to feel like an outsider in spaces he had worked tirelessly to enter. But today, the sting felt sharper. Perhaps it was the setting a first-class cabin meant to symbolize achievement and status. Or perhaps it was the way Melissa had delivered her words, with a subtle but undeniable edge that told him she saw him as different, as less. The cabin lights dimmed slightly as the flight settled into its cruising altitude. Jonathan reached for his briefcase, pulling out a notebook filled with notes for his presentation. He needed to focus, to channel his frustration into preparation. But just as he opened the notebook, Melissa returned, this time with a tray of hors d'oeuvres. Her smile had softened, but her presence felt no less intrusive. "Is everything all right, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone syrupy sweet. Jonathan glanced at her, his face expressionless. "Everything is fine," he said curtly. Melissa leaned in slightly, lowering her voice as if sharing a secret. "You know, I'm just trying to make sure you're comfortable. First class can be an adjustment for some people." Jonathan's jaw tightened. He placed the notebook back in his briefcase and folded his hands in his lap. "I appreciate your concern," he said, his tone clipped. "But I assure you, I'm quite familiar with first class." Melissa straightened, her smile now shade too bright. "Of course, Mr. Carter. Enjoy your flight." As she walked away, Jonathan felt a mix of anger and sadness welling up inside him. He had worked so hard to get to this point, only to be met with these microaggressions, subtle yet cutting. He thought about his family, about the sacrifices they had made to help him succeed. He thought about his younger self, full of dreams and determination, and wondered if this was what success was supposed to feel like. Looking out the window again, Jonathan saw nothing but clouds and endless sky. For a moment, he allowed himself to feel the weight of the moment, the injustice, the pain, the isolation. But then, he straightened his shoulders and took another deep breath. He reminded himself of his worth, of the path he had carved for himself despite the odds. He wouldn't let Melissa's words define him, nor would he let her behavior diminish his accomplishments. As the flight continued, Jonathan resolved to remain calm and composed. But deep down, he knew this was far from over. As the hum of the engines filled the cabin, Jonathan Carter tried to lose himself in the rhythm of the flight. He opened his notebook again, focusing on the notes and graphs that represented months of hard work. The meeting ahead was a pivotal one, and he couldn't afford distractions. But no matter how hard he tried to concentrate, the echoes of Melissa Thompson's words lingered in his mind, gnawing at the edges of his focus. It wasn't long before her presence returned, uninvited yet unmistakable. This time, Melissa was carrying a tray of hot towels, her polished smile now tinged with something Jonathan could only describe as audacity. She stopped by his seat once more, her movements deliberate and precise. "Here you go," she said, handing him a neatly folded towel. Her eyes lingered on him for just a second too long before she added, "You seem a little tense." Long day, Jonathan looked up, his expression unreadable. "I'm fine," he replied, keeping his tone even. Melissa's smile didn't waver. "It's just, you don't seem like you're used to this. First class, I mean." Her words hit him like a jolt, the subtle insult slicing through the calm exterior he had worked so hard to maintain. Jonathan's fingers tightened around the towel as he took a measured breath, refusing to let his emotions betray him. "Excuse me?" he asked, his voice low but firm. Melissa tilted her head, her smile widening as though she hadn't just crossed a line. "Oh, nothing," she said with a dismissive wave of her hand. "It's just that we don't see many people like you up here. You know, most of our first-class passengers, well, let's just say they have a certain look about them." Jonathan felt the heat rise in his chest, but he kept his gaze steady. He had heard variations of this before, the kind of comment dressed up as casual observation, but laced with prejudice. It was the kind of statement that made its target question their own worth, their own belonging. "I wasn't aware there was a dress code for first class," he said calmly, his voice edged with quiet strength. Melissa chuckled, the sound light but grating. "Oh, it's not about the clothes," she said, her tone teasing. "It's more about the vibe." Jonathan's heart pounded in his chest, but he refused to give her the satisfaction of seeing him ruffled. Instead, he straightened in his seat, meeting her gaze head-on. "Well," he said, his voice steady and deliberate, "I must have the right vibe, since I'm sitting here." Melissa blinked, her smile faltering for a split second before she recovered. "Of course," she said, her tone overly bright. "I didn't mean anything by it. Just making conversation." As she moved away, Jonathan exhaled deeply, the weight of the exchange settling heavily on his shoulders. He glanced around the cabin, wondering if anyone else had caught the interaction. A man across the aisle glanced up briefly before returning to his tablet, his indifference stinging almost as much as Melissa's words. Jonathan turned back to his notebook, but the numbers and graphs blurred together. His mind raced, replaying the interaction over and over, each word a fresh wound. This wasn't just about a single comment. It was about a lifetime of moments like this, moments that chipped away at the sense of accomplishment he had fought so hard to build. Moments that reminded him that no matter how far he had come, there were still spaces where he wasn't truly welcomed. Suddenly, a soft voice interrupted his thoughts. "Excuse me," said the woman seated behind him. Jonathan turned to see a middle-aged white woman with kind eyes and a professional air. Her blonde hair was neatly styled, and she wore a tailored blazer that spoke to her own success. "I couldn't help but overhear," she continued, her voice laced with genuine concern. "I just want to say I'm sorry for what she said to you." That was completely out of line. Jonathan blinked, momentarily caught off guard by her words. "Thank you," he said after a pause, his voice quiet but sincere. The woman nodded. "I'm Emily," she said, extending her hand. "And if this keeps happening, you let me know. I'm an attorney, and I don't take kindly to this kind of behavior." Jonathan shook her hand, a flicker of relief breaking through the cloud of frustration. "Jonathan," he said simply. Emily gave him a reassuring smile. "Don't let her get to you," she said. "You belong here as much as anyone else." Her words, though simple, carried a weight that resonated deeply with Jonathan. It wasn't often that someone stepped in unprovoked to acknowledge the quiet injustices he faced. As Emily returned to her seat, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of resolve. He wouldn't let Melissa's behavior define this journey. He had worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let anyone diminish his achievements. The flight continued, but Jonathan knew this was far from over. Melissa's behavior wasn't just a personal slight, it was a symptom of something bigger, something systemic. And as much as he wanted to focus on his work, he couldn't shake the feeling that this moment was part of a larger fight, one he couldn't ignore. As the flight progressed, Jonathan Carter leaned back in his seat, his thoughts a tangled web of frustration, hurt, and resolve. Melissa Thompson's earlier comments still echoed in his mind, their subtle but unmistakable sting a reminder of the barriers he had fought his entire life to overcome. Yet, amidst the tension, Emily Hayes' kind gesture lingered, as well as a small but powerful reminder that not everyone chose to turn a blind eye to injustice. The cabin lights dimmed further as the attendants prepared for dinner service. Plates clinked softly in the galley, and the faint aroma of roasted chicken and fresh bread wafted through the air. Jonathan tried to shift his focus back to the notes in front of him, but his concentration wavered. Every now and then, he caught Melissa's figure in his peripheral vision, moving briskly down the aisle, her polished demeanor masking an undercurrent of something darker. Then, almost predictably, she returned to his row. This time, she carried a tray of beverages, her practiced smile as tight as ever. "Can I get you something to drink, Mr. Carter?" she asked, her tone honeyed but sharp. Jonathan looked up at her, his expression calm but unreadable. "Just water, please," he said. Melissa set the glass on his tray table with a deliberate slowness, her gaze lingering on him once again. "You know," she said, her voice light but carrying a pointed edge, "it's always interesting to see the diverse types of people who find their way into first class these days." Jonathan felt the weight of her words hit him squarely in the chest, the veiled insult unmistakable. It wasn't just her choice of words, it was the way she delivered them, with a mix of condescension and challenge, daring him to react. This time, Jonathan decided to respond. He set the notebook aside, meeting her gaze with a calm but firm intensity. "I'm not sure what you're trying to imply," he said, his voice steady but cutting. "But I'd appreciate it if you focused on your job rather than personal commentary." For a brief moment, Melissa's polished exterior cracked. Her smile faltered, and a flicker of irritation flashed across her face. She quickly recovered, giving a tight-lipped smile. "Of course," she said, her tone clipped. "Enjoy your water." As she walked away, Jonathan exhaled slowly, his hands gripping the armrests. He felt the stares of a few nearby passengers, their curiosity mingled with discomfort. The man in the gray suit glanced his way again, his expression unreadable, before turning back to his tablet. It wasn't long before Emily leaned forward from her seat behind him. "That was completely uncalled for," she said softly, her voice tinged with frustration. "Are you okay?" Jonathan turned slightly, giving her a faint nod. "I'm fine," he said, though the tightness in his chest betrayed the truth. Emily frowned, her brows knitting together. "She's out of line," she said firmly. "If this keeps up, I'll be filing a formal complaint myself. This kind of behavior has no place anywhere, let alone in first class." Her words carried a quiet conviction that struck a chord with Jonathan. He gave her a small but grateful smile. "Thank you, Emily," he said. She nodded, her expression softening. "You don't have to deal with this alone," she added. "People like her thrive on silence." "Don't let her win." Jonathan's chest tightened again, but this time it wasn't anger or hurt. It was something deeper, a mix of gratitude and determination. He wasn't just fighting for himself anymore. Emily's words reminded him that his response to this situation could carry weight, that standing up to this kind of treatment mattered not just for his own dignity, but for others who faced similar struggles. As the dinner service began, Melissa returned once more, this time with plates of carefully arranged food. She moved briskly through the cabin, her smile plastered on, but her body language more rigid now. When she reached Jonathan's seat, she set the plate down without a word, her earlier confidence replaced by a thin veneer of professionalism. Jonathan noticed the shift, but he didn't let his guard down. He ate in silence, his thoughts swirling as he replayed the day's events in his mind. Every interaction with Melissa felt like a test, each comment a challenge to his resolve. But Jonathan was determined not to let her break him. He had faced too many battles to let one flight attendant's prejudice define him or derail his journey. He thought about his family, his community, and the countless others who had paved the way for him to sit in that seat. He thought about his younger self, full of dreams and ambition, and how far he had come. By the time the meal service ended, Jonathan felt a sense of clarity settling over him. Melissa's behavior was unacceptable, but he wouldn't let it consume him. Instead, he resolved to confront it head-on with dignity, strength, and purpose. The flight wasn't over yet, and Jonathan knew there were more challenges ahead. But as he leaned back in his seat, his gaze steady and his mind resolute, he felt a quiet confidence building within him. This wasn't just about enduring the moment. It was about making a statement, not just for himself, but for everyone who had ever been made to feel like they didn't belong. The flight settled into an uneasy rhythm. The cabin lights dimmed to a warm glow, and the hum of the engines became a steady backdrop to the soft clinking of glasses and the rustling of newspapers. For most passengers, this was just another flight, a few hours of quiet respite before they reached their destinations. For Jonathan Carter, however, it had become a battle to preserve his dignity. Melissa Thompson had made herself scarce since dinner service, though Jonathan could still feel the residual tension from their earlier exchanges. Her comments had left a mark, not just for their audacity, but for what they represented, a persistent barrier that even success and hard work couldn't always dismantle. Jonathan glanced over his notes, but his thoughts were miles away. He replayed her words in his mind, each one laced with veiled judgment, each one a reminder of the unspoken assumptions people often made about him. It wasn't just about him, he realized. It was about a system that allowed people like Melissa to feel emboldened, unchecked. As the plane cruised at 35,000 feet, Emily Hayes leaned forward again, her voice low but insistent. "Jonathan," she said, her tone careful yet firm, "you shouldn't let this slide." He turned slightly to face her, his expression thoughtful. "I appreciate your concern," he replied, his voice calm but tinged with weariness. "But what difference will it make? People like her rarely face consequences. It's easier for them to dismiss it as a misunderstanding." Emily's eyes narrowed, her determination evident. "That's exactly why you need to say something," she countered. "If no one calls this out, it keeps happening. And not just to you. To anyone who doesn't fit their narrow definition of who belongs." Jonathan considered her words, the conviction in her voice stirring something deep within him. He had spent years choosing his battles carefully, weighing the cost of speaking out against the risk of being dismissed or, worse, retaliated against. But Emily was right. Staying silent only perpetuated the problem. Before he could respond, Melissa returned to the cabin, her movements brisk, but her demeanor noticeably strained. Her polished mask seemed to have cracked, her earlier confidence replaced by a flicker of unease. She stopped by Jonathan's row, her smile tight and forced. "Mr. Carter," she said, her tone clipped, "is everything to your satisfaction?" Jonathan looked up at her, his gaze steady and unyielding. "It's been fine," he replied, his words carefully measured. Melissa hesitated, as though searching for an opening. "If there's anything else you need," she added, her voice faltering slightly, "please don't hesitate to ask." Jonathan's patience, worn thin by her earlier behavior, finally reached its limit. He set down his pen and leaned forward slightly, his voice calm but firm. "Melissa," he began, his tone carrying a quiet authority, "I appreciate your service, but I need to address something. Your comments earlier were inappropriate and unprofessional. They made me and likely others feel unwelcome in a space I have every right to occupy." The air seemed too still, the weight of his words hanging between them. Melissa's expression flickered with a mix of surprise and defensiveness. I didn't mean to offend," she stammered, her polished veneer beginning to crack. Jonathan nodded, his gaze unwavering. "Intent doesn't erase impact," he said evenly. "I hope you'll reflect on that." Melissa blinked, her composure faltering further. Without another word, she turned and walked away, her shoulders stiff and her steps hurried. As she disappeared into the galley, Jonathan felt a mix of emotions: relief, frustration, and a lingering sense of unease. He glanced at Emily, who gave him a small, encouraging nod. "You handled that with grace," she said quietly. Jonathan exhaled, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "It's exhausting," he admitted. "Having to defend your place in spaces you've worked so hard to reach." Emily's expression softened, her eyes reflecting a mix of empathy and respect. "I know it shouldn't be this way," she said. "But every time someone like you speaks up, it pushes the needle, even if just a little. It matters." Her words resonated deeply, their quiet strength reinforcing Jonathan's resolve. He knew this wasn't just about Melissa. It was about a broader fight for equity, for spaces that welcomed everyone, regardless of their background. As the flight continued, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the path that had brought him here, the obstacles he had faced, the sacrifices he had made, and the unwavering support of his family and mentors. Their belief in him had carried him through the darkest moments, reminding him of his worth, even when the world tried to diminish it. He thought about his younger self, the boy who had dreamed of breaking barriers and shattering stereotypes. That boy had faced countless challenges, but had never given up. Jonathan owed it to him, and to countless others like him, to keep pushing forward. By the time the plane began its descent, Jonathan felt a renewed sense of clarity. This flight was more than a journey to a business meeting. It was a moment of reckoning, a reminder of the responsibility he carried as someone who had navigated and overcome systemic barriers. As the wheels touched down on the runway, Jonathan looked out the window at the city lights below. He knew this wasn't the end of the story. It was just the beginning. As the plane began its descent, the hum of the engine softened, and the city lights below glimmered like a tapestry of possibilities. Jonathan Carter, seated firmly by the window, felt the weight of the past few hours settle over him like an invisible burden. His confrontation with Melissa Thompson had been necessary, but it left him emotionally drained. He glanced at his watch, counting down the minutes until the flight would land, hoping to leave this experience behind. But the journey was far from over. Melissa had not returned to the first-class cabin since their exchange. Her absence was conspicuous, a silent acknowledgement that she had overstepped. Jonathan wasn't seeking her apology. It wasn't about her. This was about a system, about an ingrained mentality that saw people like him as outliers, even in spaces they had worked tirelessly to earn. The captain's voice crackled over the intercom, announcing their approach. Passengers stirred, adjusting seat belts and gathering belongings. Jonathan leaned back, letting the announcement wash over him, his thoughts elsewhere. Emily Hayes, seated behind him, tapped his shoulder gently. "Jonathan," she said, her voice quiet but purposeful, "I've been thinking about what happened. This can't just end here." Jonathan turned, meeting her steady gaze. "What do you mean?" Emily straightened in her seat, her expression resolute. "I'm going to report this to the airline," she said. "They need to know what happened. And if they try to brush it under the rug, I'll help you take it further. This kind of behavior isn't just wrong, it's dangerous. It sends a message to everyone watching that it's okay to treat people like this." Her words hit Jonathan like a wave of clarity. He had spent much of the flight trying to endure, to keep his composure, to not let Melissa's behavior derail him. But Emily was right, this wasn't just about him. It was about making sure no one else had to endure the same quiet indignities, the same unspoken judgments. "Thank you," he said after a moment, his voice laced with gratitude. "But this isn't your fight." Emily shook her head, her tone firm. "It's everyone's fight, Jonathan. If we want change, we have to stand together. You've already taken a stand by calling her out. Now it's time to make sure it doesn't end there." Jonathan looked at her, his chest tightening with a mix of appreciation and apprehension. He wasn't used to this, having someone not just sympathize but actively take up his cause. It felt both humbling and empowering, a reminder that allyship could be a powerful force. As the plane touched down and taxied to the gate, Jonathan felt a sense of resolution settle over him. This moment, as uncomfortable and painful as it had been, could be a catalyst for something bigger. The passengers began disembarking, the quiet shuffle of footsteps and the hum of conversations filling the cabin. Jonathan gathered his belongings, his movements deliberate. Emily waited for him, her bag slung over one shoulder, her determination evident in her posture. Together, they exited the plane, stepping into the bustling terminal. The fluorescent lights and distant announcements felt jarring after the tense intimacy of the flight. But Jonathan felt lighter, buoyed by the resolve he shared with Emily. As they walked toward the baggage claim, Emily pulled out her phone. "I'm going to email the airline tonight," she said. "And I'll make sure they know this won't just go away." Jonathan nodded, his voice steady. "I'll back you up. They need to hear from both of us." Emily gave him a small, approving smile. "Good. They'll hear us loud and clear." For the first time since boarding the flight, Jonathan allowed himself a genuine smile. This wasn't how he had imagined this trip unfolding, but maybe it was exactly what needed to happen. As they reached the baggage claim, Jonathan thought about his family, his community, and the younger generations who would one day step into spaces like first class. He wanted a world where they wouldn't have to defend their place, where they could exist without questioning whether they belonged. Emily's voice broke through his thoughts. "Jonathan, you're not alone in this. Don't ever forget that." Her words, simple but powerful, resonated deeply. Jonathan looked at her, his resolve solidifying. "I won't," he said. "And neither will they." The terminal buzzed with activity, a sea of travelers flowing in every direction, their faces a mix of weariness and anticipation. For Jonathan Carter, the bustling crowd felt like a welcome reprieve from the confines of the plane. Yet, as he walked alongside Emily Hayes toward the baggage claim, the events of the flight lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon. True to her word, Emily had already drafted an email to the airline's customer relations team, detailing the behavior of the flight attendant and emphasizing the need for accountability. She read it aloud to Jonathan as they waited for their luggage, her voice steady and precise, every word chosen with care. "I want them to know this isn't just about one flight," Emily said, her eyes sharp with determination. "It's about the culture they're allowing to exist. If they don't address it, they're complicit." Jonathan nodded, a quiet but firm agreement etched into his features. "And if they try to deflect or dismiss it," he said, "we push harder." By the time Jonathan arrived at his hotel that evening, the email had already been sent. Emily had CC'd him, ensuring he could follow the correspondence. The message was concise yet powerful, painting a clear picture of Melissa Thompson's behavior and calling for an immediate investigation. As Jonathan settled into his room, his phone buzzed with a notification. He glanced at the screen. Emily had forwarded him the airline's automated reply, promising a response within 48 hours. He exhaled slowly, setting the phone down. The fight was just beginning. The next morning, as sunlight filtered through the blinds, Jonathan woke to a flurry of emails and missed calls. Among them was a message from the airline's customer service team, apologizing for the inconvenience he had experienced and assuring him they were taking the matter seriously. But as Jonathan read the email, a familiar sense of skepticism crept in. The language was polite but vague, carefully crafted to acknowledge the complaint without committing to meaningful action. He immediately forwarded it to Emily, who called him moments later. "They're playing it safe," she said, frustration evident in her tone. "It's a non-apology. They're hoping we'll let it go." Jonathan's jaw tightened. "We won't," he said simply. Emily's voice softened. "I'll draft a response," she offered. "They need to understand this isn't going away." As the day progressed, the situation began to ripple beyond the confines of Jonathan's inbox. Word of the incident had reached the ears of a fellow passenger who had discreetly recorded part of Melissa's interaction with Jonathan. By evening, the video had found its way to social media. Jonathan's phone buzzed incessantly with notifications. Friends, colleagues, and even strangers were tagging him in posts, expressing outrage at the blatant prejudice on display. Within hours, a hashtag began trending, calling for the airline to address systemic discrimination in its operations. At first, Jonathan felt overwhelmed by the sudden surge of attention. He had always been a private person, preferring to let his work speak for itself. But as he read through the comments and messages, he began to see the impact of the video. People were sharing their own stories of similar experiences, their voices amplifying a collective demand for change. Emily called again that evening, her voice tinged with both urgency and excitement. "Jonathan, this is bigger than just us now," she said. "People are paying attention. We have a chance to make a real difference." Jonathan leaned against the desk in his hotel room, the weight of the moment settling over him. "I didn't expect this," he admitted. "I just wanted to get through the flight." "But you didn't let it slide," Emily reminded him. "You stood up for yourself, and now others are standing with you. That's how change happens." Jonathan let her words sink in, their truth undeniable. This wasn't just about him anymore. It was about creating a world where no one had to endure what he had faced. The next morning, the airline issued a public statement acknowledging the incident and promising an internal investigation. The CEO, facing mounting pressure, committed to reviewing the company's policies and implementing mandatory diversity training for all employees. While the statement was a step forward, Jonathan knew it wasn't enough. Real change required more than words. It demanded action and accountability. Emily called him again, her voice filled with a mix of determination and hope. "This is just the beginning," she said. "We've got their attention. Now we make sure they follow through." Jonathan nodded, his resolve strengthening with every passing moment. "We will," he said. As the day unfolded, Jonathan found himself reflecting on the journey that had brought him here. He thought about his family, his mentors, and the countless others who had supported him along the way. Their sacrifices and encouragement had shaped him into the man. He was a man who refused to stay silent in the face of injustice. The path ahead was uncertain, but Jonathan felt ready to walk it. With allies like Emily by his side and a growing chorus of voices demanding change, he knew this was a fight worth fighting. This wasn't just about one flight or one airline. It was about building a better, fairer world, one step, one stand, one voice at a time. Jonathan Carter sat in his hotel room, staring at his laptop screen. The words on the airline's latest public statement blurred together as his thoughts raced. The airline had finally acknowledged his experience, promising an internal investigation and diversity training for staff. Yet, the statement felt hollow, polished, but devoid of true accountability. He couldn't shake the feeling that it was more about controlling the narrative than addressing the root cause. The video of Melissa Thompson's behavior had gone viral, and with it came an avalanche of public attention. Social media platforms buzzed with hashtags, personal stories, and calls for systemic reform. Jonathan had become the unwitting face of a movement, a symbol of the quiet indignities so many endure daily. While the support was overwhelming, it also weighed heavily on him. He hadn't asked for this role, but it had found him nonetheless. As he scrolled through the comments on the viral post, he saw a mix of outrage, solidarity, and painful accounts from others who had faced similar discrimination. One comment in particular caught his attention. "This isn't just about one flight. It's about how society decides who belongs. Thank you, Jonathan, for standing up for all of us." The words hit him like a tidal wave. He thought about his younger self, a boy who had dreamed of breaking barriers, but had also internalized the subtle messages of exclusion. He had spent years working harder, being better, and proving himself in spaces that often saw him as an outsider. Now, those years of quiet endurance had become a rallying point for something larger. Emily Hayes called later that evening. Her voice carried a mix of determination and exhaustion. "Jonathan, I've been monitoring the response," she said. "The pressure is building on the airline, but we need to keep pushing. A statement and some training sessions aren't enough." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, nodding even though she couldn't see him. "You're right," he said. "This has to go deeper. Policies, accountability, transparency. Without those, nothing changes." Emily sighed, her tone softening. "I know this is a lot, and I can't imagine how overwhelming it must feel. But you're doing something incredible. People are listening because of you." Jonathan hesitated, the weight of her words pressing down on him. "It's not just me," he said quietly. "It's everyone sharing their stories, standing together. That's what's making this bigger than one person." Emily's voice softened further. "And that's exactly why your voice matters so much." The following day, Jonathan received an invitation from a national news network to appear for an interview. He hesitated, unsure if he was ready to step into such a public spotlight. But as he thought about the countless stories he'd read, the people who had reached out to thank him for speaking up, he knew this wasn't just about him anymore. It was about using his platform to amplify a message that needed to be heard. The interview aired that evening. Sitting across from the anchor, Jonathan felt a wave of nervous energy as the cameras rolled. He had rehearsed his thoughts, but knew the real power lay in speaking from the heart. "This isn't just about a single incident," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "It's about a culture that allows prejudice to go unchecked. It's about the countless people who face moments like this every day, often without the opportunity to speak out. My hope is that this moment becomes a catalyst for change, not just within the airline, but across industries and communities." The anchor leaned forward, her expression earnest. "Jonathan, what would meaningful change look like to you?" Jonathan paused, choosing his words carefully. "It starts with accountability," he said. "Not just acknowledging the problem, but taking real steps to address it through policies, training, and creating systems that ensure discrimination has consequences. It's also about fostering environments where everyone feels like they belong. That takes more than statements. It takes action." The interview sparked another wave of support, with people sharing clips and praising Jonathan's composure and clarity. But not all the feedback was positive. Critics emerged, accusing him of overreacting or seeking attention. The negativity stung, but Jonathan reminded himself why he had chosen to speak out. Late that night, as he scrolled through his messages, he came across one that stood out. It was from a young man named Marcus, who wrote, "I watched your interview, and it gave me the courage to finally speak up about what I've been dealing with at work. Thank you for showing me that it's okay to demand respect." Jonathan stared at the message, his chest tightening with a mix of pride and humility. Marcus's words were a reminder that this fight wasn't just about policy or corporate promises, it was about empowering individuals to believe in their worth. By the end of the week, the airline announced additional measures, including an independent review of its practices and a partnership with advocacy groups to address systemic discrimination. While the changes were promising, Jonathan knew the work was far from over. He reached out to Emily, sharing his thoughts. "This is a start," he said, "but we have to hold them to their promises." Emily agreed. "And we will," she said. "This isn't just a moment, it's a movement." Jonathan felt a surge of determination. The road ahead would be challenging, but he was ready to walk it. Not for recognition or accolades, but for Marcus, for the countless others who had been silenced, and for a future where no one had to question their belonging. As he looked out over the city lights that night, Jonathan felt a quiet resolve settle within him. This journey had begun with one flight, one moment, but its impact was growing. And for the first time, he truly believed that change was possible, not just in policies, but in hearts and minds. The airline's public statement stirred mixed reactions. Some saw it as a step in the right direction, a sign that the company was acknowledging the issue. Others, including Jonathan Carter, recognized it for what it was: damage control, a polished attempt to pacify an outraged public without addressing the deeper problem. Jonathan sat in the quiet of his hotel room, scrolling through the comments on social media. Stories from strangers poured in accounts of discrimination in airports, hotels, workplaces, and beyond. Each story resonated deeply, reinforcing the painful reality that Melissa's behavior wasn't an isolated incident. It was part of a much larger systemic issue. A notification caught his eye, a direct message from the airline's customer service team. They wanted to arrange a private meeting with him to discuss his experience and find a resolution. Jonathan's initial reaction was skepticism. He knew this wasn't about resolution, it was about minimizing damage. His phone buzzed, interrupting his thoughts. It was Emily Hayes. "Jonathan, I just saw the airline's latest statement," she said, her voice sharp with frustration. "They're still skirting accountability. This meeting they're offering, it's not for you. It's for them." Jonathan nodded, even though she couldn't see him. "I know," he said, "but maybe it's an opportunity." Emily paused. "An opportunity for what?" "To make them listen," Jonathan replied. "To make sure they understand this isn't about a one-time apology. It's about systemic change." Emily's tone softened, though her determination remained. "If you go, you won't be alone. I'll be there with you." Jonathan smiled, a flicker of gratitude breaking through his resolve. "Thank you, Emily," he said. "I appreciate that." The meeting was scheduled for the following day at the airline's regional headquarters. As Jonathan and Emily arrived, the atmosphere was palpably tense. A polished conference room awaited them, its sleek design a stark contrast to the raw, unresolved emotions Jonathan carried with him. Seated across from them were two senior executives, their tailored suits and carefully neutral expressions designed to convey professionalism. The CEO had joined via video call, her face framed neatly on the screen. "Mr. Carter," one of the executives began, her voice smooth and rehearsed. "First, let me thank you for taking the time to meet with us. We deeply regret the experience you had on our flight and want to assure you that we take this matter very seriously." Jonathan listened silently, his face impassive. Emily sat beside him, her notebook open, ready to document every word. The executive continued, outlining a vague plan for sensitivity training and a review of internal policies. But as the meeting went on, it became increasingly clear that their goal was damage control, not meaningful change. Jonathan finally spoke, his voice calm but laced with quiet authority. "I appreciate the acknowledgement," he said, "but this isn't just about me. It's about the countless others who've experienced similar treatment, many of whom never speak up. Words and training sessions aren't enough. What are you going to do to ensure this doesn't happen again?" The CEO, her expression carefully measured, responded. "We understand your concerns, Mr. Carter, and we're committed to creating an inclusive environment. We're already implementing diversity training." Jonathan interrupted, his tone still measured but firm. "Training is a start, but it's not a solution. You need accountability. Policies that have real consequences for discriminatory behavior. Transparency about the steps you're taking and the progress you're making. Anything less is just performative." The room fell silent. Emily glanced at him, pride evident in her eyes. The CEO cleared her throat, her composure slipping slightly. "We'll take your recommendations into serious consideration," she said. Jonathan leaned forward slightly, his gaze unwavering. "Consideration isn't enough," he said. "Action is." As they left the meeting, Jonathan felt a mix of relief and lingering frustration. He had spoken his truth, but whether the airline would follow through remained uncertain. Outside the building, a small group of reporters had gathered, their cameras trained on him and Emily. The story had gained traction, and the public wanted answers. Jonathan hesitated for a moment, then stepped forward. "I'm here today because what happened to me on that flight wasn't an isolated incident," he said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. It's part of a larger problem, a system that allows discrimination to go unchecked. I spoke up because I believe we can do better, and I'm grateful for the support of so many who've shared their own stories. This isn't about blame, it's about change. Real, lasting change. The reporters peppered him with questions, but Jonathan kept his answers focused. He wasn't interested in fueling outrage, he wanted to channel it into something constructive. As he and Emily walked away, she turned to him, her expression thoughtful. "You handled that perfectly," she said. Jonathan sighed, his shoulders relaxing slightly. "I just hope it makes a difference," he said. Emily gave him a reassuring smile. "It already has." The days following the meeting with the airline executives were a whirlwind for Jonathan Carter. What had started as a single, unsettling encounter on a flight had now grown into a national conversation. The video of Melissa Thompson's behavior continued to circulate online, sparking debates about systemic discrimination and the need for accountability in corporate culture. Jonathan was no longer just a passenger with a story. He had become a symbol of resilience and the fight for equity. Media outlets reached out for interviews, community leaders invited him to speak at forums, and strangers sent messages of support and solidarity. While the attention was overwhelming at times, Jonathan felt a deep sense of responsibility to use this moment to drive change. One evening, as he sat at his desk reviewing notes for an upcoming summit on diversity and inclusion, his phone buzzed. It was Emily Hayes. "Jonathan," she said, her voice carrying a mix of excitement and resolve. "Have you seen the latest update from the airline?" Jonathan opened his laptop and navigated to the news. The airline CEO had issued a public apology, not just to Jonathan, but to all customers who had experienced discrimination. The statement was accompanied by a detailed plan, comprehensive diversity training for employees, an external review of policies, and a commitment to transparent reporting on progress. "They're finally taking this seriously," Emily said. "Your voice made that happen." Jonathan leaned back in his chair, the weight of the moment settling over him. "It's a step," he said thoughtfully. "But we need to make sure it's not just a PR move. Change has to be real, and it has to last." A week later, Jonathan found himself standing on a stage at a national summit on racism and discrimination. The room was filled with community leaders, activists, and professionals from various industries, all eager to hear his story. As he stepped up to the podium, Jonathan took a deep breath. The spotlight was on him, but he knew this wasn't about him. It was about the countless others who had faced similar challenges. "I never imagined that a simple flight could turn into a moment like this," he began, his voice steady, but tinged with emotion. "What happened to me was wrong, but it wasn't unique. It's part of a system that too often tells people they don't belong, that they aren't enough." The audience sat in rapt attention as Jonathan recounted the events of the flight, his confrontation with Melissa, and the subsequent efforts to hold the airline accountable. He spoke not just of his own experience, but of the broader implications, the silent struggles so many endure, and the collective responsibility to challenge injustice. "But here's what I've learned," he continued, his voice rising with quiet determination. "Change doesn't happen in isolation. It happens when we stand together, when we refuse to be silent, and when we demand better not just for ourselves, but for everyone." The room erupted into applause, a standing ovation that lasted several minutes. Jonathan stepped back from the podium, humbled by the response. As he looked out at the faces in the crowd, he felt a profound sense of connection, a shared belief in the power of collective action. After the summit, Jonathan was approached by a young woman who introduced herself as Maya. Her voice trembled slightly as she spoke. "Mr. Carter, I just wanted to thank you," she said, her eyes glistening with tears. I've faced discrimination at work for years, but I was always too afraid to speak up. Seeing you stand your ground, it gave me the courage to finally file a complaint. I don't know what will happen, but for the first time, I feel like my voice matters." Jonathan's throat tightened as he listened. He placed a reassuring hand on her shoulder. "Your voice does matter," he said gently, "and I'm proud of you for using it. Don't stop. Change starts with people like you." As Maya walked away, Jonathan felt a surge of purpose. Her story, like so many others, was a reminder of why this fight was worth every ounce of effort. Months later, the airline released its first report on the changes it had implemented. The findings were promising: a significant reduction in customer complaints related to discrimination, positive feedback from employees about the new training programs, and ongoing partnerships with advocacy groups to address systemic issues. Jonathan read the report with a mix of satisfaction and cautious optimism. The journey wasn't over, but progress was being made. As he closed the document, his phone buzzed with a notification. It was a message from Emily. "Look at what you started." Jonathan smiled, his heart swelling with gratitude. He replied simply, "What we started." That evening, Jonathan sat by the window of his home, watching the city lights twinkle in the distance. He thought about the flight that had changed everything, the allies who had stood by him, and the countless voices that had joined the call for change. It wasn't the journey he had planned, but it was one he wouldn't trade for anything. He knew there would be more battles ahead, more challenges to face. But for the first time in a long time, he felt hopeful. Because he had seen what could happen when people stood together, when courage met compassion and determination fueled progress. And in that moment, Jonathan Carter made a promise to himself and to the world. He would keep fighting, not just for himself, but for everyone who deserved to belong, to thrive, and to be seen. The journey was far from over, but the path forward had never been clearer.